As industry in the 1800s ascended, railroads were the basis of the nation's industrial economy, creating new markets, carrying billions of tons of freight to every corner of the country, and opening up the West to development. But with that development came low-tech and unsafe working conditions, rugged terrain, and the noxious gases and unstable explosives used to create tunnels. One such project claimed the lives of over 190 men before it was completed, earning it the nickname the Bloody Pit. And with that title, it also became known as one of the most haunted places in New England. This is that story, and it is extremely strange. In the beautiful and rugged expanse of the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts, in the small town of North Adams, there sits a monument to American industriousness, labor, and ultimately the lives sacrificed in its creation. It's called the Hoosac Tunnel. Its origins date back to 1819, when a canal route was sought to connect Boston to Albany, New York. In 1825, civil engineer Loami Baldwin was hired to survey a possible route, but the cost of his plan proved prohibitive due to the presence of the vast Hoosac mountain range. Then in 1841, paper mill owner Alva Crocker began to lobby for a northern railroad route which would benefit his and other mills in the northern towns of Massachusetts. By 1845, a route from Boston to Fitchburg was opened, with the ultimate goal of stretching north. To do this, a track through the Deerfield River Valley would have to be established, with a tunnel bored through Hoosac Mountain. By 1851, the ambitious $2 million project began, with the initial excavation taking place in North Adams. A $25,000 apparatus known as Wilson's patented stone-cutting machine, designed and built by Munn & Company of South Boston, was utilized to begin boring into the east side of the mountain. The idea was to cut a 24-foot opening through the mountain in just over 4 years' time. Unfortunately, 12 feet into its initial test dig, the machine bound up and came to rest there, where it would remain for a number of years. The only alternative was to employ a star drill, which would be hammered forward by a 20-pound sledgehammer whilst being turned manually by a two-man crew. Then the resulting 2-foot deep holes would be filled with black powder explosives and blasted out, with the debris manually removed from the tunnel. The project underwent various changes in methods and machinery as different ideas developed, but it would not be finished until 1875. But the cost exceeded the money spent, compounded by the inevitable delays and frustrations. It was also paid for in human lives. And that's where the story of the haunting of Hoosac Tunnel begins. In 1865, the Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel, whose fortune was bequeathed to establish the Nobel Prize, had taken an oily liquid known as nitroglycerin and created a blasting explosive that was eventually introduced to America. Believing this to be a godsend, its first application was used in the Hoosac Tunnel. On March 20th, explosive technicians Ringo Kelly, Ned Brinkman, and Billy Nash planted a charge of nitro and quickly made their way to a safety bunker. Unfortunately, Ringo prematurely ignited the charge, and Brinkman and Nash were caught in the blast and buried alive under tons of debris. Kelly became detached and hardly engaged with any of his fellow workers, confiding in a select few that he was being followed by mysterious dark figures, and when he found himself alone, was hearing disembodied voices. Then one day, Kelly simply disappeared. And it wasn't until 2 days later that his lifeless body was found 2 miles inside the tunnel, at the very spot where his colleagues Brinkman and Nash lost their own lives. Kelly had been strangled. Deputy Sheriff Charles Gibson placed the murder at between midnight and 3:30 a.m. and suspected Kelly was killed by a fellow worker as retribution for his fatal error that cost 2 men's lives. An investigation was launched, but a lack of definitive suspects resulted in the case eventually being closed. The work would continue. However, it would not be long before other mine workers began to tell stories of their own encounters with indistinguishable shadowy figures inside the tunnel, occasionally accompanied by moans of agony and horrible shrieking. This resulted in some of the more superstitious workmen becoming convinced that Kelly had been killed by the spirits of Brinkman and Nash in an act of vengeance, and that their ghosts now haunted the tunnel. They began to believe the tunnel was cursed, and many refused to enter it at all, while others left the job completely. Soon this feeling of dread would begin to manifest in others who simply visited the project. Production was being negatively affected by these circumstances, so project managers contacted a local clergyman to bless the location, and some local academics were also invited to the site to determine more rational conclusions for what was being experienced. In 1868, Paul Travers was among those. He was a mechanical engineer who had served as a cavalry officer in the Civil War and was well respected for his courage and intellect. It was hoped he could pass off the voices as perhaps wind blowing through the tunnel, and the shadows as mere figures of the imagination or a result of the poor lighting conditions. But his conclusion was, to say the least, unexpected. Accompanied by one of the project managers, they entered the tunnel at 9 p.m. and proceeded 2 miles into the shaft. As they stood there, they both were certain they heard what sounded like a man groaning in agony, a sound he claimed to hear many times during battle. Turning up their lamps, they were surprised to see they were the only ones in the tunnel at that time. Uncharacteristically, Travers admitted to being frightened by this occurrence, as was the project manager, who was equally shaken. So perhaps the workers were right about this place. But if these experiences could terrify even the hardiest and most stoic of men, no one was prepared for what was about to happen next. 1 month later, on October 17, 1868, an even greater disaster took place. A buildup of naphtha gas resulted in an explosion in the tunnel's central pumping station, raining rock and debris down on the 13 workers who were inside. Many perished instantly in the blast, but the few who survived found themselves being pushed deeper inside the shaft by a torrent of water and mud. Some would drown, but a handful created a raft out of debris to hold on to a bit longer, before eventually succumbing to suffocation as the tunnel's air pumps had been destroyed. One worker, known only as Mallory, agreed to be placed in a bucket and lowered by rope into the shaft to attempt to help any possible survivors. When he was brought back up to the surface, a barely conscious Mallory claimed there were no bodies to be found and only muttered the words, "No hope." With the pumps demolished, the shaft quickly filled with water, and some of the bodies of the drowned men eventually floated out into surrounding waterways. The makeshift raft was not located until a year later, with the remaining bodies still clinging to it. During the time it took for the bodies to resurface, a reporter for the local North Adams Transcript by the name of Glenn Drohan wrote the following. During the time the miners were missing, villagers told strange tales of vague shapes and muffled wails near the water-filled pit. Workmen claimed to see the lost miners carrying picks and shovels through a shroud of mist and snow at the mountaintop. The ghostly apparitions would appear briefly, then vanish, leaving no footprints in the snow, giving no answers to the miners' calls. But as soon as the raft-bound miners were found and given a decent burial, the visitation ceased. The eventual resumption of work only yielded more reports of terrified workers who still heard the eerie moaning of injured men. 4 years after the fatal explosion, Dr. Clifford Owens, along with drilling operations superintendent James McClinstry, went into the tunnel at 11:30 p.m. They traveled the usual 2 miles into the shaft where other supernatural encounters had taken place. It was cold and dark, and they were guided only by their oil lamps. While they were talking, they heard what Owens described as a mournful sound, as if someone was in great pain. Then they saw a dim light approaching them through the tunnel. At first they thought it to be a workman coming toward them, but as it grew closer, it took on a bluish color and morphed into the body of a man without a head, who appeared to be floating a foot above the floor. The figure came close enough to be touched, but the men were by now frozen in fear. The illuminated figure just remained there as if looking at the men, and then floated off in a different direction. Later, Owens wrote, "I am above all a realist, nor am I prone to repeating gossip and wild tales that defy a reasonable explanation. However, in all truth, I cannot deny what James McClinstry and I witnessed with our own eyes." On October 16, 1874, a local hunter named Frank Webster vanished. He was found 3 days later by a search party walking aimlessly on the banks of the Deerfield River. He appeared to be in a state of shock. He told his rescuers that he heard weird voices in his head commanding him to enter the Hoosac tunnel. He then felt his rifle pull from his hands and then was beaten over the head with it. When found, his rifle was indeed missing, and he had no recollection of ever exiting the tunnel. But the cuts and bruises on his head and body seemed to verify the beating he claimed to have taken. After the first train passed through the now completed tunnel in 1875, stories of strange encounters continued. That fall, a fire tender named Harlan Mulvaney drove his horse-drawn carriage into the tunnel late one night. Mulvaney abruptly turned his horses around and bolted from the tunnel. 2 days later, workmen found his horses and the wagon 3 miles away in a wooded area, but Mulvaney was never seen again. Then in 1958, noontime diners at the Bridge Lunch in nearby Pittsfield saw and felt a locomotive pass by the establishment at a very high rate of speed, literally shaking the building. Concerned by the excess speed of the train, the owner, John Quirk, called the Boston and Maine Railroad to register a complaint. Railroad officials contacted denied even having a train on that route that particular day. Even more puzzling was the description Quirk gave to them of it being a steam locomotive, something not used on that particular line in several years. Yet the reports of this phantom train continued, always traveling the tracks between Union Street Depot and North Street Bridge at excessive speed. In March of that same year, the train was again witnessed by diner patrons at 6:30 a.m. one day. In 1974, Quirk told the Berkshire County Eagle, "We saw it regardless of what anyone else tries to tell us. It consisted of 5 or 6 coaches. I can describe that locomotive down to the last bolt. It was so clear and plain that I was even able to see the coal in the tender, and my customers saw it just as plainly as I did." There is at least one story, though, that suggests the spirits of Hoosac Tunnel also watch over workers there, and in one such case saved a man's life not once, but twice. A more recent encounter was reported to a local paper in 1977. Joe Impaco told the story of going to work for the Boston and Maine Railroad at the age of 18. He was chipping ice from the tracks one winter day when he heard a voice say, "Run, Joe, run." When he turned, he saw train number 60 bearing down on him and managed to jump back from the tracks and avoid certain death. When he looked around to see who had warned him, he saw no one. 6 weeks later, attempting to free freight cars from the frozen track with a crowbar, again he heard a voice shout at him, this time saying, "Joe, Joe, drop it, Joe." When he dropped the bar, it was instantly struck by an arc of 11,000 volts of electricity from an overhead power line that had short-circuited. Yet another time, while removing downed trees from the tunnel entrance, Impacco narrowly avoided a huge oak tree falling toward him. As he ran from the impact, he swears he heard a disembodied voice in a full-throated laugh as he did so. Eventually, Joe quit the job and moved from town, but superstitiously he returned each year, somehow convinced that if he didn't, some tragedy might befall him. He chose not to return in 1977 when his wife fell ill and wanted him to remain home with her. She passed away in October that year, with Joe believing his failure to visit the tunnel that year paved the way to her death. A parapsychologist from Agawam, Massachusetts, claimed that after he entered the tunnel one night in 1976, he saw the figure of a man wearing period work clothes who appeared to be surrounded by a white glowing light. Then there is philosophy professor Ali Allmaker from North Adams College, who was also an amateur ghost hunter. In the 1980s, he was accompanied by a railroad official one night when he visited the tunnel and claimed he experienced an eerie feeling inside, coupled with the sensation of someone unseen walking behind him. North Adams students would occasionally place a tape recorder in the tunnel and then leave. When listening to it a day later, they'd claim to hear the sound of muffled voices on the tapes. Strange encounters at the Bloody Pit continue to this day, with locals and intrepid explorers claiming that odd winds, spectral apparitions, and disembodied voices still emerge in and around the tunnel. But be warned, the tunnel is still active and at least a dozen freight trains run through it every day, so you'll want to think twice about venturing inside under any circumstances. So with its supernatural past and present, one has to wonder if the Mohawk tribe who once inhabited the area knew this particular mountain was to be avoided. Hoosac, in their native language, means forbidden. A lesson 190 souls learn in the most tragic of ways.